From the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, this is NATO 2020, a new podcast series pitching fresh ideas for the world's oldest military alliance. I'm your host, Terry Schultz, and I've been covering NATO a long time, so I know a lot about how it's been doing things. But this series is about how it could be doing things better. The Atlantic Council commissioned a series of 20 recommendations as to how the 70-year-old alliance could freshen up a bit heading into the next decade. Some of these are ideas we've heard before, and some of them are brand new. All of them are aimed at making the alliance more responsive and resilient to the threats that definitely get more creative all the time. In this episode, we're going to look at the recommendation to set NATO's sights on the high north. The authors are Jim Denoy, a non-resident senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. He also served as the National Intelligence Manager for Europe and NATO at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. The other author is Marisol Maddox, an Arctic analyst at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Polar Institute. She's also a non-resident research fellow at the Center for Climate and Security. Welcome, both of you, Jim and Marisol.
Thank you very much, Terry. It's great to be with you and reunite with Marisol.
Yeah, you guys have been apart for a year now, even though you're in the same city. No casual lunches. All right, so let's get right into it. As we've sort of been chatting, we talk about the Arctic a lot, and increasingly much, of course, with climate change making it a much more feasible venture to move around up there, and some actors are doing so. Between the two of you, why don't you just lay out why you believe NATO isn't doing much up there, not doing enough in any case?
Well, I guess I'll go ahead and kick it off. And I would just caveat by saying they're moving a little bit, but not fast enough. I mean, our view is that the Arctic will be really the terrestrial domain of consequence for the 21st century. And if not, we should act as if it will be. I mean, certainly the Arctic region accounts for about 4% of the Earth's surface, and 5 out of the 8 Arctic states are NATO members. So you would think that NATO would have seized on this for quite some time. But as with any large organization, and now you have 30 members in the alliance, there are differences, and there are also competing priorities. I mean, Marisol and I were talking about this as we were going through conducting the piece. You have a lot of stakeholders, but NATO's trying to juggle a lot of balls up in the air. And right now, you've got China as an emerging power, and you've got the longstanding competition with Russia and cyber issues. But if you look at it and you peel it back, there's an Arctic nexus with all of those issues: China, Russia, the importance of security, and the fact that there are 5 out of the 8 Arctic members are out of NATO. But NATO's a huge bureaucracy. It moves at a slow pace. As we were saying, you can't use the term glacial pace anymore because the glaciers are melting. So maybe that will speed up NATO's focus on it. So we believe that there's growing attention even within the alliance and how slowly it moves. So we're optimistic that this issue is going to gain traction.
But Marisol, if you asked NATO, would it believe it doesn't have an Arctic strategy at all? Because I don't think it feels like it's not doing enough up there. Everyone knows that these threats are there. We talk about it a lot. We talk about the secret surveillance, the whales with harnesses, all kinds of surreptitious movements up there. Do you think the alliance feels like it's behind the times?
I think that, well, first of all, we have seen an increase in exercises, and then also in the NATO 2030 report, there was some interesting language specific to Arctic. First of all, they're talking about this era of strategic simultaneity, which I think is a really cool phrase. That really does speak to the future of the threat environment as we're facing not only more conventional challenges from state-based actors, but also an increase in non-state threats like climate change, biodiversity loss, and ocean acidification. But they specifically talk about in the NATO 2030 report about increasing NATO's Arctic situational awareness through the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and then also about updating the 2011 Alliance Maritime Strategy to specifically acknowledge the increasing awareness of the Arctic as a strategic priority. And then especially because we are now, as of 2019, NATO recognizes space as an operational domain, and the Arctic is, as the high north, literally, it is a very geostrategically important place for space operations, both for command and control, and then also a place like Svalbard, which has the only commercial ground station that covers 14 polar orbits. So looking at the way that those factors tie in addition to looking at real strategic communications, sea lines of communication that are incredibly important. So I think there is an emerging recognition in dialogue that expresses that we do need to be looking at the Arctic, but I think there's questions about, like countries like Canada have concerns about sovereignty, especially when it comes to things like, the freedom of navigation, because of some, just differences in interpretation. And then just also not wanting to, I guess, overextend NATO's presence because they are in so many parts of the world. But I think that we are seeing that this really is an important region to be including.
But explain why, even if they have questions, why anyone would decide that the better option is simply not to have a cohesive strategy. I mean, what is dividing them to the point where doing nothing is the default? Or not nothing, but too little, as you put it.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a couple things. So, it's a consensus-based organization, and some actors within NATO just aren't thinking about the Arctic because they have more immediate concerns in other parts of the world. And so I think that it would be really useful to have like an Arctic working group, for instance, that could really help to start to articulate just, the bottom line up front, bluff for within NATO to be really communicating well why this region is very important to the alliance. And then I think another part of it is that, what NATO looks like in the Arctic is a very nuanced conversation and then very important because you don't want to be contributing to security dilemma dynamics because there's a lot of sensitivities with, not wanting to, do something that would seem provocative to Russia and then kind of seeing that tit for tat where it's a really unhealthy dynamic that can easily develop. So it just needs to be a very carefully calibrated approach, but it needs to be an approach.
But Jim, it was at least 2, maybe 3 years ago that China came up with the term Polar Silk Road. Add this to the angst over the Belt and Road Initiative, that is growing in Europe. In addition to the addition of China to NATO's sort of radar about concerns. I mean, why would we be wringing our hands in Brussels, but not moving ahead? Why is a strategy on China now being formulated, but not a strategy on the Arctic, which is, on the territory, at least some of it on the territory of NATO?
Well, I think there's going to be, what we're seeing is a convergence on that in terms of Europe's growing concern about China operating in the Euro-Atlantic space. You mentioned China's Arctic policy, which it developed in 2018, and it declared itself a near Arctic state, which is an interesting term, given the fact that the closest point of China to the Arctic is about 900 miles. I like to say that's akin to New York City calling itself a near Midwestern town. But I think what we have here is a convergence here in terms of Europe's growing concern about China operating in Europe and what we see in terms of China's ambitions in the Arctic and the possible sort of compact between China and Russia on Arctic issues. Russia wants to develop the Arctic. It always has. I mean, you can go back to the Soviet and Tsarist times in terms of Moscow's aspirations in the Arctic. Right now, Russia needs it needs deep pockets. It needs financial investment. China's interested in the Polar Silk Road, as you mentioned, as a way of shortening the shipping times from Asia to Europe. And so there's a possibility that we would have at least a convergence of interest between China and Russia. That concerns Europeans as well as North Americans and Canadians and the United States. I want to get to a point that Marisol said, which is, I think, fundamental to why NATO has moved slowly. And that is the fact that Arctic states like Canada in particular felt that the Arctic was an issue for Arctic states. And as Marisol said, a sovereignty issue, and they really didn't want the issue to become a subject of focus or concern or debate amongst the NATO members. But even Canada is recognizing that we're seeing the climate change affecting the dynamic in the Arctic. Human activity is going to be increasing, and they realize that there's a role for NATO to play, and I think that's a significant development, because we, the U.S., the NATO as an alliance, really needs Canada on board to really pursue the goals, at least the goals that we express in our paper in terms of dealing with China and taking a holistic approach to Arctic security. It's not just a military dynamic, it's a holistic approach in terms of redefining what security means. And that means security of the environment, the security of the indigenous peoples up there. NATO has to take a refined and as Marisol said, a nuanced approach toward the Arctic.
But this, of course, has given Russia free rein to advance, basically up to the point where it touches NATO nerves, because with no pushback from NATO and them knowing that there's no consensus, how far has that allowed Russia to move into the Arctic? I mean, we see these reports of mysterious submarines being found in Swedish waters. I mean, in addition to the whale story, which I loved, a whale wearing a Russian harness being found. I mean, the stories are really great, right? They're old spy war stuff that, always, I always love nostalgically. But seriously speaking, what are the real dangers? I mean, we talk a lot about the deep sea cables that are in a vulnerable position there. And NATO has increased now its attention, as you mentioned. But, is it too late? Is it too late because Russia's gotten such an advantage there in the meantime?
No, I don't think it's too late. Although, I think our attention, the U.S.'s attention and the NATO alliance and really the global community's attention was elsewhere for quite some time. Certainly after 9/11, our focus was on addressing the global war on terrorism and prosecuting that conflict. We were in Iraq, we were in Afghanistan. The Arctic really wasn't on our scope. Meanwhile, Russia, of course, is the largest Arctic state by territory. Moscow views the Arctic as strategically important across all of its elements of national power, not just security, but economic, political, diplomatic. I mean, it's a prestige issue. I mean, Russia is on a trajectory of wanting to be the dominant Arctic power in the 21st century. So they certainly have gotten a head start. They've refurbished a number of old Cold War era military bases and facilities and added a few others, really aimed at, and here's where the issue is this offensive in nature or is this defensive? I mean, obviously we're trying to discern intent in this regard, but I think overall you could look at it in terms of securing the Northern Sea route. And controlling access to the Northern Sea route, which is significant. I think most people who watch these issues on a daily basis sort of characterize Russia's actions as primarily defensive in nature. I mean, however, it does have the potential to interdict NATO operations in the region and is certainly a concern of the U.S. and Canada and our NATO members. So we are wakening up to that fact. I'll finish with this in this part here is that certainly after 2014, when Russia seized the Crimea and we saw what is potentially possible and what Putin's agenda is in the region, in with Syria, with Georgia, with Crimea, that I think that awakened the alliance that we at least need to address Russia's actions in the Arctic. We just cannot allow Russia to continue to move forward with its military modernization and refurbishment and its goals without at least facing up to it to some degree.
Well, you would have been in government when the U.S. made the decision to basically pull out of Iceland. And I visited there and saw, the old hangars had been turned into movie studio shooting studios, and all of the places where American service members had lived were now refurbished into apartments. And but now the U.S. is going back. The hangar is being rebuilt. It's probably done by now since I visited for the bigger surveillance planes that are necessary. Isn't it more expensive than having stayed there? Or, I mean, again, a lot of intelligence was lost during that time, wasn't it?
Certainly. I'll jump in real quick. I was part of that in 2006, part of the delegation that went and had to give the Icelanders the bad news about Keflavik and how we were moving forward. Some would say that it was short-sighted. Others would say, hey, we had a lot of competing priorities, and we only have a finite amount of resources. So that was, in my view, that was regrettable because look who jumped into that void. Actually, the Chinese jumped in the void because Iceland was having some economic problems, and China took an advantage. And China has actually used Iceland as a means of getting its foot in the door in the Arctic. And so, yes, I think it's a lesson for us and a lesson for the alliance when we pull out. Nature abhors a vacuum, and who's going to move in? If it's not the Russians, it's certainly going to be the Chinese. So we're going to have to be there. We're going to have some degree of presence. It might not be overwhelming presence, but we need to have our flag out there, so to speak. NATO has to have a presence there to say, hey, look, NATO, what happens in the Arctic is important to the alliance, and we will have a presence.
And to follow up on that, I would just say that China, when they bailed Iceland out, that actually enabled them to sign the first free trade agreement with a European country, which is pretty notable. And then just going back to the previous point about Russian militarization, I mean, some of it definitely is the fact that their northern flank is becoming exposed because of climate change. And so there are threats associated with that any country with the landmass that Russia has in the Arctic would reasonably then seek to firm up. But like Jim was saying, it is notoriously difficult to discern defensive capabilities from offensive ones, and parsing that out, and especially when you look at certain places like Wrangel Island and militarization there and how close that is to Alaska. And then just also the increasingly sophisticated nature of weapons that are being tested in the region. So it is definitely a concern, but it's, I think, something that I don't think that the new Cold War language is very useful for this context, because I think that it's important to look at these developments in a measured way that is realistic about the threats that we are facing, but that isn't inflammatory in any way, or that might, kind of rhetoric that could kind of fan the flames of, tension that is starting to creep into the region, and that was more pronounced, especially under the last administration, with more that great power competition focus. And it really does continue to be an area where the 8 Arctic countries do work together very well through the Arctic Council, and that continues. The US and Russia just recently signed an agreement on a joint contingency plan for the Bering and Chukchi Sea region for pollution response. And that was, just like a month ago. And so we are seeing this cooperation at the operational and tactical level continue, and I think that's really important to note. And the same thing with the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, and search and rescue and marine environmental response operations.
So there's certainly going to be a reticence to give up the practical ways that things are working there, but Russia will use any opportunity to call NATO organization of anything a provocation. So certainly if NATO were to start organizing, certainly I think the most provocative of your suggestions were an Arctic Rapid Reaction Force. I mean, it'll be the emoji with the brain exploding, won't it?
Well, yeah, I think it's a given that Russia, anything NATO is going to propose here that really is aimed at building NATO solidarity and focusing on its core mission, which is collective defense, is going to raise Russia's ire. I mean,
because the status quo is so beneficial, right? Because the status quo is so beneficial to them. I mean, any move by NATO is much worse for Russia.
Absolutely. But I think, NATO has to move forward. I mean, it has to move forward in terms of reaffirming the rules-based order in the Arctic. It has to focus on deterrence, its core mission. And, there's been much discussion in terms of, hey, look, we know it's inevitable that as the polar ice cap shrinks, human activity is going to increase. And with that human activity comes security implications. So what we could do is I won't say bury our head in the sand. In the Arctic, I guess you bury your head in the ice cold water and not recognize what's going on. Or you could move forward to say, look, this could be the wild, wild north, or we could move in terms of trying to establish codes of behavior. And there have been discussions that have circulated around in terms of developing actually a military code of conduct for the Arctic, for not just NATO nations, but all nations that have the capability to project military power in the region. That is Russia and increasingly China. So, NATO could actually lead the way in developing that military code of conduct, if not externally, at least within the alliance, and they could use that as an example and possibly put political pressure and moral pressure on other players to act accordingly. So what we're saying is, look, the region is going to become increasingly important. It's going to increase the human activity, as I mentioned before, and the alliance needs to play a role, taking into account the various stakeholders that are in the region.
Do you think Russia and or China would go for that? I mean, at the moment, the U.S. is pulling out of agreements with Russia. Open skies, being one that most Europeans thought was working sufficiently well. So, would there be a big appetite for moving into another agreement like that, another multinational agreement?
Well, I think Marisol was quite persuasive when she was talking about there are areas that were already cooperating with Russia and have in the past. I think it's a fool's errand for anyone, us bilaterally or NATO as an alliance, to think that we could deal with the challenge of security in the Arctic without addressing Russia. It is the biggest player in the region, and it has enormous stakes. So I think Russia, in some ways, has a vested interest in not seeing an escalation of military activity in the region. Certainly we do as well. So I think there are areas of common concern where we can at least put those issues on the table, and that's why we have suggested that maybe through the NATO-Russia Council, although Russia would bristle, and we're not saying that it would be easy.
Nothing happens at the NATO-Russia councils.
Yeah, stiff arm, but there certainly. I think the alliance has to make clear that it has a role to play, and it wants to cooperate with Russia to ensure that the Arctic does not become a region of confrontation, let alone conflict. So that's what I think the NATO approach needs to be in this regard.
But Marisol, don't you think that some of your suggestions are mutually exclusive? I mean, going back to the rapid reaction force, once you create something like that, you no longer probably can draw Russia in to acting like this is all, very, very friendly, because that sounds provocative. So is this a menu out of which some options would work, but then you would have to, sort of forget about the others? Or is the range of suggestions that you make, are they all possible at the same time?
Yeah, well, I think, part of with this paper, with it being a bold idea, the idea is to just spark conversation. And so it's kind of being a little bit provocative with some of the suggestions, because we did lay out several, just to get conversation going. And I have to say, in the months since this was published, I've had so many great conversations with people who have agreed and disagreed with what we wrote about. And I've really enjoyed that, and have, it's been interesting to see how things have also developed since that time. Russia definitely does not, anything with NATO, they're not going to be super eager and willing to cooperate. And that's why we actually specifically articulate that for something like, working towards establishing better communication between, Russia and the United States and other Arctic actors, and then also China as a non-Arctic actor, but one who is relevant to regional security, that is something that, venues like Munich Security Conference can be really useful in, and that NATO should encourage that dialogue to occur, but should not necessarily be an active participant initially, because their presence would immediately kind of put up some barriers for the possibility for cooperation and constructive dialogue to result. But there are other ways that NATO, I think establishing this, rapid response team, or, different ways that NATO can enter the Arctic region, that can be done in a way that serves the goals of why they're entering the region, which is, first of all, like Article 5, you need to have that operational capability if something does occur, and we need NATO's, response there. But that isn't done in an unnecessarily provocative way. And I think that's where that kind of nuanced conversation comes in. And, what's the lowest visible way that NATO can assure that capability, provide the reassurance and necessary deterrence, while not being overly provocative. And that's where it just is nuanced and needs to be carefully calibrated.
Is it surprising that over the last several years of NATO being helmed by a Norwegian, that this didn't have a higher priority? Because Secretary General Stoltenberg often talks about, having grown up in that area and having, this border at the north with Russia. So it's kind of strange that he wouldn't have elevated this, isn't it?
Well, the Secretary General has probably been one of the few that's consistently talked about the Arctic, at least rhetorically. And as you mentioned, the Norwegians have always been forward-leaning on the desire to have a really credible role for NATO in what they define as the High North. But, the Secretary General is just the Secretary General. And as Marisol mentioned, NATO is a consensus organization. The decisions are made at the capitals. They're not made in Brussels. And so he can only do what he can only do. I mean, but he has certainly made it clear that the Arctic needs to be a priority for the alliance. And so I think he's finally gaining some traction for the reasons we talked about earlier, in terms of what Russia's done over the past few years, and now China's entry into the Arctic domain. But the important thing is, unless NATO shows that it can operate effectively and have a persistent presence in the Arctic, nothing it wants to do or steer the debate or influence countries regarding the Arctic are going to matter at all. It's all going to be rhetoric. So they really have to demonstrate that they're serious about it, that they have a strategy, and in fact that they can operate in that harsh environment. And so, exercises that they've had, like Trident Juncture in 2018, the fact in the context as we talk about this NATO Arctic Rapid Reaction Force to be deployed only for the reasons as we mentioned, and Marisol, I think, said it brilliantly in terms of what the intent. It's always about the intent of why they would be deployed, but it's all to demonstrate that NATO is serious about the Arctic. It will have a presence there. It will be a persistent presence. That's what's needed, and that's currently really what's lacking. The rhetoric now is there, but we need to see more tangible actions regarding the alliance moving forward on the Arctic.
So just a final thought from you. You wrote this paper during the last administration when they were China all the time. China was the big enemy, the big threat. And since this came out, also the reflection paper, the NATO 2030 ideas are coming out, where China does indeed play a bigger role in NATO's concerns. So do you think, because maybe we've gotten sort of used to what Russia is doing there, do you think in the end it will be concern about China, which, as you mentioned, is a non-traditional actor there, that will push NATO to finally collect itself and come up with a more pointed strategy in the Arctic?
I think, and go ahead, Marisol, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, it has specifically been articulated that there is concern about the presence of Chinese submarines in the Arctic. And so something like that, combined with, like seeing certain dynamics with Russia increasing, like, just increased frequency of SNAP exercises, live fire exercises, just there was that incident last summer, I guess, where Russia was doing an exercise and they went into the U.S. EEZ, which is fine, off the coast of Alaska, but there was some issues with the fishermen who were also there, and so just the possibility that there could be some kind of issue or conflict, that I think that is definitely an increasing recognition, coupled with also just, space domain, sea lines of communication, and looking at that as well.
Yeah, I think we've seen what China can do if it's left unchecked. I mean, in the South China Sea, and so, while it may appear that China has been a little diverted with COVID and some of the other priorities that they have, I mean, they have a strategy for the Arctic. They will be increasingly aggressive as the years and the decades move forward. And I think concern about what China is doing worldwide, to include the Arctic, has the potential to give this issue greater importance within the alliance. I think now even the Secretary General and others, when they talk about China and what China is doing around the world, they mention the Arctic along the other issues that they're concerned about.
Well, we'll see what makes it into the reformulation of the strategic concept, right? I mean, there's room to rewrite NATO's goals at the moment, and the Secretary General is doing that. So I guess we'll find out how many of your ideas he takes on board, right?
Hopefully all of them, Terry.
Presumably so.
Sorry, can I add one quick thing?
Sure.
That I think is just important to mention, and that is specifically Svalbard, because of the really unique governance structure around it. I think that that is something that it's a place where it really needs to be articulated that Article 5 would apply, because that has not been officially articulated. And we know that because of the fisheries protective zone and kind of that uh, unusual status of the EEZ, and that there is difference in interpretation of the extent of Norway's sovereignty over the EEZ around Svalbard. And China, we know, is very interested in the fish, and that's something that I think is also really important, because of, again, like, that is where we have this commercial ground station that has the coverage for the 14 polar orbits. It is an important location, and so I think that that is an especially vulnerable place if we're looking at particular areas of concern because of that very unique governance structure. So just something I wanted to articulate.
Articulate. I can only hear that when you're saying it. That's so stupid. I know. It's late at night in Brussels. My excuse. Many thanks to both of you, Marisol Maddox and Jim Denoy, for your recommendation that NATO set its sights on the high north. And you can find all 20 ideas at atlanticcouncil.org, and tell us what you think on Twitter at #StrongerWithAllies. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.